you might want to take a look at the different options that the Blacksmith has available for you. And I'm not talking about random mythic unique caches. No, it's that one just above there. The Blacksmith cache. For the raw price of 200 rawhide, 200 iron chunk, 200 veil crystal, 5 forgotten soul, and 1,000,000 gold, you could craft one of these caches, and then whatever character you open it on will generate a piece of gear for them. The benefit of the cache is that it will always be at least a legendary piece of gear. If I were to just buy one of these real quick and open it, we get ourselves a random ring. Easy peasy, we got a random legendary. It wasn't the perfect aspect roll, the stats on it are kind of mid, and it's not an ancestral, but how many of these would I have to open to prove to you that something drastically different needs to be done with this, either cutting down the costs or upping the chances of finding good gear? And not only that, what if I told you I actually already did all of that? I opened up 100 of these things. You want to see it all? These 2 stash shabs are completely populated by individual caches that I opened, one at a time. I've cataloged all of them, the aspects that I got, the relative strengths that I got, the amount of uniques, the amount of ancestrals, and I put it all together into a data sheet to show you what the expected outcome is. If you were to open up 100 of these, maybe you're making an alt character or trying out a different build, looking for a perfect aspect, or just looking to shore up some of the gear issues you might be having, what would you expect to get out of these? Well, luckily, I got a data sheet for you. I know, pretty par for the course here, but this one's really good. I know this one doesn't look too impressive, and maybe this one doesn't look too impressive, but it's here where we start to get into some absolutely buck wild stuff that I'm actually going to cover in a completely separate video, because apparently the majority of the aspects in this game are just like broken and lying to you. But again, that's for a future video. But when we look at how many pieces of gear we generated, how many ancestral pieces of gear we generated, and how many pieces of unique gear that we generated, again, over 100 caches. 100 caches, and I'm going to show you the math for like how ridiculous of a number that is in a little bit. The numbers tend to play out on average similar to how items drop in the world. This actually helps to shed a little bit of light on a conspiracy I've been seeing thrown around, because I believe in this one too. But the breakdown of what we got in total, we got 94 legendary pieces of gear. We got 6 unique pieces of gear. Of those, we got 3 ancestral legendary pieces of gear. I'll just go ahead and cut to the quick. None of them were perfect aspects. None of them were even inside of the ancestral aspect range. And none of them were upgrades for my gear. So, you know, like Crimea River, right? Out of the 94 legendary pieces of gear, 46 of them were armor pieces. Most notably, we got a ton of helms, a ton of boots, and then an average amount of chest, pants, and gloves. Of the jewelry, there were 27 pieces with a pretty equal distribution between amulets and rings. And then for the weapons, a total of 21 weapons were found, with the majority of them basically being completely average throughout. We didn't get any shields, which is a little bit interesting. And the other very interesting thing to notice is that out of all of the weapons, we only got 2 focuses. Now, that might not seem that weird, but you have to remember that a focus can only go into the offhand, whereas every other weapon is a main hand weapon. So the difference between how many main hand weapons we got and how many offhand weapons we got is pretty stark. And this feeds into a bit of a conspiracy that I've seen, which is just that focuses aren't dropping in the game. And if these caches are generating in the same relative rates that items drop naturally, I think there might be something to it. But okay, great. We're going to get a ton of armor because armor is the most amount of gear pieces if you were to, you know, kind of put them all into one group. Obviously, weapons is the second biggest total amount of gear pieces that you can get. And then your jewelry. But what did it really come out to? Like, what type of aspects did I get? How strong were they? Can I expect to be able to create a whole new character on a whole new class and walk away with a full suite of aspects if I were to generate 100 of these caches, which again was stunningly expensive and really cut into my resources? Well, that's where we have to start looking at the actual aspect ratios, what we got, the relative strength of what we got, how many of them, and whether or not we even got one of each at the end of the day. And while I could touch on just like the relative coordination of stats, like how many pieces of gear were viable to use, I started trying to come up with a way of trying to like objectively determine this thing. And it just turns out that depending on your build, you need different stats. So basically every single piece of gear could be a piece of gear. They all had core stat on them, some maximum life. They had relevant crit and attack speed. Some had skill rank, some didn't. Again, it's the pretty typical generation rate of all of these stats. So I'd say out of the 100 that we found, at least 50 of them could probably be used on a character just for the stats that they had. There's no real way for me to objectively quantify that in a more precise way. But the aspects, I could get real nerdy about them. And rather than go table by table and tell you the exact outcomes, I more so just want to show you how I recorded these things and how I calculated the numbers that I think that you should be aware of. Basically what I did is I went through every single piece of gear and I recorded every single aspect that dropped. Not only that, I recorded what the highest total value of the aspect that I got. So Swelling Curse can get up to a certain amount of additional critical strike chance. We got a 22% roll. What does that mean realistically as far as like comparative strength? Just very quickly jotted down whether or not we managed to get a max roll of any aspect, which I'm happy to report we at least got some. Now, sadly, they were all max rolls for non-ancestral pieces of gear, which means that they had a significant amount of growth left across ancestral pieces of gear, but it's just nice to see a handful of perfect non-ancestral outcomes. And then I had to calculate the strength of the aspect. Now, I at first basically just took the number that I got, divided it by the highest value that it could be to get a number. And it turns out that that's not really representative of the strength. Most aspects come in a range of 1 to 21 ranks. It turns out that the aspect that you have isn't just a random number between the minimum and the maximum. They all go up in a linear fashion or decrease in a linear fashion. Now, again, I'm going to put out a whole video about how they're mostly lying to you, because it turns out the game can't figure out whether or not to round up or round down, and a lot of the aspects aren't showing you floating decimals and are pretending like they're integers. Again, completely separate video. But what we instead had to do was calculate what rank the highest aspect that we found was out of its total, and then we divided that rank number by the maximum rank number. This gave us a much cleaner expectation of how strong the aspect was in comparison to how strong it could be as a perfect roll. Next time I just captured how many of each aspect we got, because some of them we got multiples, meaning that if we expect just a random output of aspects from any one item to be generated, which we haven't necessarily seen to be true the majority of the time, you could typically expect that these multiples would come up, obviously, but they also could have filled in as some aspects which we hadn't seen before. There's no way to really delve into what the likelihood of that is without a significantly larger data set. For our offensive aspects, we actually got a metric ton of offensive aspects, and it turns out it's just because offensive aspects can roll on a large amount of the different pieces of gear. The average aspect strength, meaning the average rank that the aspect was in the lower 50 percentile, so less than the average outcome. Basically, the aspects that we saw in total wouldn't net you more than 50% of the total rank. So if yours was a 1 out of 16, most of them fell below 8 ranks on the aspect. And while that doesn't mean that they're all trash, because many aspects gain different amounts of power based off of how high the roll on them is, it does mean that after 100 of these bad boys coming out, of the offensive aspects that we got, each one of them would only be about half as strong as they could be. And on average, of the aspects that we got, we tended to get more than one of them. So we had more than one pull at the majority of these aspects on average. So even if you got like a min roll on one, maybe you got a higher roll on a different one. If you weren't aware, the Necromancer has a total of 47 offensive aspects that can be used on gear. Of those 47, we managed to pull 25 of them, meaning that we got a 53% of the total amount of aspects. Now, the issue with this part here is that there are a ton of generic aspects that the Necromancer also gets to use, like all classes. And what that leads to is a bunch of aspects in this average number tend to not really be things that would activate any one build. So we didn't quite get the full suite of aspects that we would want for any one of the builds that we were looking for. And considering that, at least for the Necromancer, as an example again, we have something close to like 10 or 11 completely viable endgame builds that can all clear at least tier 80 in the pit. So what does that mean for us? If I have 11 builds and I only pulled 25 of these aspects, I could probably only expect to be able to build out maybe like 4 or 5 of them, and each one of those will only be about half as many of the aspects that we need. For defensive aspects, there's a total of 14 in the game for the Necromancer. We found 7 of them, so that's exactly 50% of them. On average, again, the power of each one that we found was below 50%, so 0.46. And on average, we found over 2 of each one of these aspects. You have to remember that there are each one of your armor pieces, except for your boots, can roll defensive aspects. Similarly, if we had found a shield, it could, but we did not. And then your amulet can also roll with defensive aspects. So that's a lot of pieces of gear for these to be able to populate onto. For utility aspects, there are a total of 19 in the game. We actually found 13 of them. So we found nearly 70% of all of the utility aspects that are currently there. These, again, were on average only 50% of the power that these aspects could have. And again, we found more than 2 on average of any one of them. Resource aspects, which I would argue are some of both the most rare and the most expensive aspects. If you're thinking about the Necromancer here and you're thinking about Spirit Wave, one of our most popular builds, you need the Fast Blood aspect. Well, turns out I just didn't find one here. In fact, Fast Blood aspect just seems to on average be significantly more rare than other ones. While this data set is nowhere near conclusive enough to be able to say that, it's just generally what's being reported. But of the 13 resource aspects, we only found a whopping 3. Now you have to remember that resource aspects can only generate on amulets and rings, so that's a significantly smaller pool of total items which they could generate on. For their relative strength, these tended to be below average again, so 0.44, and then we only found 1 of each of them from our pool. The last type of aspects are mobility. These can only generate both on boots as well as on amulets. Of the total of 8 mobility aspects, we found 5, so that's 63% of the total. They were on average below 50%, so 0.45, and we found slightly more than 1 of each of them. That's all well and good, Mac. There was a lot of different numbers, but just give me the total. Just tell me what happened. Okay, I got you. Our total average power of our aspects across all of the different groupings that we had, taken across all 96 pieces of gear that generated with them, was less than 50%, so they were on average 47% of their total power. There are a total of 101 aspects that the Necromancer can get. We only found 53 of them. It's a whopping 52% of them. So if we consider the lack of resource aspects, which again tend to be one of the more restrictive and more potent or powerful aspects to get onto a build, and then just the lack of representation across our offensive aspects with 100 caches in the bank, just one data set. So obviously there's a lot of averaging that would come out from larger data sets. I don't necessarily believe that this is a reasonable expectation to be able to just take your second character across a different class, be able to properly twink them out and be able to play a build that you need the aspects to be able to enable, completely ignoring uniques and mythic uniques. I'm just talking about getting a character started, just getting into Torment 1, etc. But why am I really hammering on this? The outcomes here were fairly decent, about 50% of all the aspects that you could want with 100 caches. Well, how much does 100 caches cost you? If 1 cache is 1,000,000 gold, 200 of both types of component, 200 veiled crystals, and 5 forgotten souls, what does 100 look like? Well, I can't even make 100. Why? Because I already made 100. But even just 25 of them ends up being 25 million gold, 5,000 rawhide, 5,000 iron chunks, 5,000 veiled crystals, and 125 forgotten souls. If we just multiply that by 4, we're talking about 100 million gold, 20,000 hide, 20,000 iron chunks, 20,000 veiled crystals, and 500 forgotten souls. You may look at the gold that I have and go, Mac, this can't be a problem for you. You're sitting on 10 billion gold. And I'll be honest with you, I'm actually kind of poor by trading standards. I just haven't kept up with it. But the reason why I have this much gold is because the third-party market on Diablo.trade is where I typically go. I can go sell a 1 to 2 GA pair of Crew Ores Embrace from anywhere between 500 million to 2 billion gold. And I've sold 30 of those dudes. Why? Because I had to keep buying gear for all the different builds that I have. The average player should not expect to have anywhere near this gold. Not only that, the average player shouldn't expect to generate anywhere near that amount of resources. I have done, no joke y'all, hundreds of boss rotations. The reason why boss rotations are so good is because you get to salvage all the unique pieces of gear. Also, they just drop a metric ton of resources, a metric ton of gold over time. You can also sell the gear, etc. If you watch Wudijo's most recent feedback for season 7 video, he goes into why boss rotations are just so absolutely cracked. They're just best for everything. So if you haven't personally done hundreds upon hundreds of boss rotations, as well as sold multiple billions of gold worth of gear on the third-party market, you really can't expect to have these types of resources. But I wanted to put that into perspective. How much does it cost to do this? And how much generally should you expect to be able to make the resources that are necessary to be able to actually do this thing? One last little set of data. Right here, I have the cash cost highlighted. Again, I made 100 of these, so it was 100 million gold, etc., etc., etc. You get the deal. And I'm going to compare this against an activity that most people do that generates the majority of the resources that are necessary to do this thing and the expected output from it. So here I went and did a whisper cache. You remember whisper caches, right? They were like super cool for a really long time and you used to be able to generate like 30 plus million gold from them. Well, they really chopped those bad boys down. But just taking your average whisper cache, which requires you to get 10 whisper tokens or whatever it is, meaning you got to go kill a blood maiden and then run a dungeon and then go in and turn in your cache and wait for the 1,000 materials to all fall to the ground. Your average cache, not like a super cool golden legendary one, etc., generated 4.6 million gold, 500 rawhide, 300 iron chunks, 113 veiled crystals, and 40 forgotten souls. If I'm being generous, if I'm assuming that you're also salvaging all of the gear that actually drops from the cache itself, you can probably do between 2 and 2.5 caches for every single whisper that you do. Now, what does this mean for how many of these I would have to do? Because it's easy to see these numbers and go, that actually seems like fairly simple, right? If we just get a little bit more conservative, just make this math a little bit easier for my little lizard brain, and we say you can make 2 caches per whisper turn in. This is assuming that you have like all of the benefits that a season's journey could get you for doing a whisper cache, etc. I would need to do 50 whisper turn-ins, 50 full whisper caches worth of cracking them open, salvaging anything, and getting all the materials together to go generate 100 caches for an alt character, to get less than 50% of the total aspects that I would want, getting less than 50% of the aspect strength that those aspects could be, generating maybe 1 to 3% of these as ancestral pieces of gear. Now, the question becomes, is this reasonable? Is this a reasonable expectation for this gold sink? And as well as, at what point are you expected to do this gold sink? I argue no. And here's why. Having to go do a whisper on my primary character would quite literally be just better to then hand off the whisper cache to my alt character. So it would cost me nothing. It would take the same amount of time for your average person who only has 1 to 2 ways to be able to generate money in this game if they're not trading, which is doing the whisper caches in the first place. And then my alt character can just open the whisper cache. You would also get the benefit of getting the experience from the whisper cache, as well as the gear from it would be per the character that opened it. So I could either just run whispers and hand them off to that character, and those whispers can be better targeted because they'll be from specific types of caches. They tend to have better loot outcomes in them as well. I don't really think it makes sense for expediting the twink character, just be able to like get them some gear to get them started. So if it's not for that purpose and it's strictly worse than having them open up the whisper caches, then where is it supposed to fulfill a need? Well, it's very expensive, and only a max level character could really be able to generate these types of resources at a rate that's high enough to use this as a legitimate item generation tool. So if it's meant to be used for an endgame character to take random shots at potentially getting gear upgrades or finding a unique that they need or getting some ancestral gear so that they can start powering up their character, it doesn't perform in that regard either. Incredibly high cost for a crapshoot. You don't even get to choose what type of gear it is. While obols are worse in that they generate magic and rare gear, you at least know the item type that you're going to do. And all of the same activities that would be generating you obols, meaning doing events, typically in things like the Helltide, would also be getting you whisper cache turn-ins. So you get the obols, you get the whisper cache turn-ins. Neither one of these cost you money, they just cost you time, and they both can better target farm and generate gear for you. So I think it kind of doesn't support either end goal. I don't think it's good for twinking. I don't think it's good for generating endgame gear. It's a very weird sync in the aggressiveness of how much it costs, considering all of these exact same requirements are across every other sync that we have. You have to spend all of this for tempering. You have to spend all of this for enchanting. You have to spend all of this for imprinting. You have to spend all of this for masterworking. And at some point, you're just going to run out of resources. And I know the majority of players really have. We just keep hitting bottlenecks here. So I just don't know where in the game this is supposed to fill in. But here's what I'm going to do for you. I'll include the data sheet down below so you can do your own analysis. You can take a look at it. You can just make sure that I, dotted all my I's and crossed all my T's. I'd love to hear from you. Have you had better success with this? Are more people generating data for this? And are there different findings? Did I just get a crap outlook from over 100 data points, which I highly doubt, but you never know. you know, law of large numbers, right? You got to fail eventually. And with enough people doing something, failures seem to pop up more and more. So let me know down in the comments. I'd really appreciate it. Any insight would be great, because ultimately, if this could be better, I'd love to get that feedback into the hands of the developers. Hey, if you're brand new here and you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, leave a like on the video as well. It helps me out a ton. I hope that you enjoyed this almost certainly completely unnecessary delving into a mechanic that I think the majority of people didn't know, but hopefully it gets better. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.